It's Thursday, October 12th, 1307. If you're a Knight Templar in France, you're going to bed tonight thinking you're untouchable. You're part of the most powerful military order in Christendom. You have fortresses across Europe. You run what is essentially the world's first international banking system. Kings and popes owe you money. You've spent nearly 2 centuries defending the Holy Land and accumulating wealth beyond imagination. Tomorrow morning, you're going to wake up in chains. Because at dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France is about to execute one of the most coordinated military operations in medieval history. Across France, royal soldiers are going to simultaneously raid every Templar property, arrest every Templar knight, and seize every Templar asset they can find. And here's the truly remarkable part. It's going to work. By sunset tomorrow, the most powerful military order in the world will be in ruins. Nearly every Templar in France will be in prison. And an organization that survived Saladin, the fall of Jerusalem, and 200 years of warfare will be brought down in a single day. This is the story of how it happened. How a king destroyed the Templars. How one coordinated strike dismantled an empire. And how Friday the 13th became the unluckiest day in history. Let's start with a question. Why would anyone attack the Knights Templar? Because to understand the raids, you need to understand just how powerful these guys were. The Knights Templar were founded in 1119 in Jerusalem, originally as a small group of knights sworn to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Noble goal, right? But over the next 2 centuries, they evolved into something far more complex and far more powerful. First, they became the elite fighting force of the Crusades. Templar Knights were the special forces of medieval warfare, heavily armored, expertly trained, and bound by vows that made them fearless in battle. They literally had a rule that said they couldn't retreat unless outnumbered 3-1. They fought to the death, and they scared the hell out of their enemies. But here's where it gets interesting. The Templars also became bankers. And not just any bankers, they basically invented international banking as we know it. Here's how it worked. Say you're a pilgrim in France who wants to travel to Jerusalem. Carrying gold across thousands of miles of dangerous territory is a terrible idea. So you go to a Templar commandery in France, deposit your money, and receive a letter of credit. When you arrive in Jerusalem, you go to the Templar headquarters there, present your letter, and withdraw your funds. Boom! International banking. The Templars also made loans to kings, financed crusades, and managed royal treasuries. They had a network of fortresses and commanderies across Europe and the Middle East that functioned like medieval bank branches. They were trusted, they were sophisticated, and they were rich. Very, very rich. By the late 1200s, the Templars owned estates and properties across Europe. They had fleets of ships. They collected tithes and rents. They held mortgages on castles. Some estimates suggest they controlled up to 15 of Europe's wealth. And all of this was tax-exempt, because they were a religious order under the direct protection of the Pope. You can see the problem, right? You've got an organization that's militarily powerful, financially wealthy, politically independent, answering only to the Pope, not to kings. From a king's perspective, that's a threat. A massive, heavily armed, incredibly wealthy threat operating inside your kingdom. Enter King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. And boy, did he have problems. Philip was dealing with massive debt. His wars with England had drained the treasury. He'd already tried to raise money by debasing the currency, which created inflation and made him deeply unpopular. He'd expelled the Jews from France and seized their property, which gave him a short-term cash injection but didn't solve his long-term problems. And then he looked at the Templars. All that wealth, all those estates, all those assets just sitting there in commanderies across France. Now, Philip couldn't just rob them. The Templars were protected by the Pope, and attacking a religious order would create massive political and religious backlash. Philip needed a reason, a justification that would let him destroy the Templars and seize their wealth without looking like the greedy tyrant he actually was. So he created one. Starting around 1305, Philip began gathering accusations against the Templars. And these weren't just financial crimes. Philip went for heresy, the worst possible charge in medieval Christendom. The accusations were wild. The Templars denied Christ and spat on the cross during secret initiation ceremonies. They worshipped an idol called Baphomet. They engaged in homosexual acts. They kissed each other in obscene places during rituals. Were any of these accusations true? Almost certainly not. They were standard medieval conspiracy theories, the kind of stuff people accused groups they didn't like of doing. The Templars were Christians who'd spent 2 centuries fighting and dying for the faith. The idea that they were secretly heretics is absurd. But Philip didn't need truth. He needed an excuse. And heresy was the perfect charge because it justified destroying the Templars while making Philip look like a defender of the faith. Philip spent months planning the operation. He consulted with his advisors. He coordinated with his military commanders. And most crucially, he kept it secret. This is what makes the October 13th raids so remarkable. The secrecy. Philip managed to organize a simultaneous nationwide operation without the Templars finding out. In an age without telephones or radio, when communication was slow and rumors spread fast, Philip pulled off what was essentially a medieval Pearl Harbor. Here's how he did it. Philip drafted sealed orders and sent them to his officials across France weeks in advance. The orders were marked to be opened only on October 12th. The officials didn't know what they were planning until the day before it happened. The orders were explicit. At dawn on October 13th, raid all Templar properties, arrest all Templar knights, sergeants, and officials, seize all Templar assets, records, and documents, use force if necessary, take everyone into custody for interrogation. Philip timed it for dawn because that's when the Templars would be in their commanderies, attending morning prayers. They'd be unarmed, in their religious robes, not their armor. They'd be vulnerable. So let's walk through what actually happened. It's the night of October 12th, 1307. You're a Templar knight at the Paris Temple, the Templars' headquarters in France. You go to bed that night with no idea what's coming. There have been rumors, sure. King Philip has been asking questions about the order. Some people have been spreading stories. But the Templars have dealt with accusations before. You're under the Pope's protection. You're untouchable. Around 4 a.m., you're woken by shouting and the sound of doors being smashed open. Armed men are flooding into the commandery. You're still in your night clothes when soldiers grab you, bind your hands, and drag you into the courtyard. All around you, the same thing is happening to your brothers. Knights, sergeants, even the administrative staff, everyone is being arrested. The soldiers are reading from a royal decree, accusing you of heresy, blasphemy, and obscene practices. You're loaded into wagons and taken to a nearby royal prison. Within hours, nearly every Templar in Paris is in custody. The same scene is playing out across France, in Lyon, Toulouse, Marseille, everywhere the Templars have a presence. Thousands of arrests, all coordinated, all happening simultaneously. By the end of the day, approximately 2,000 Templars are in prison. The entire French branch of the order has been decapitated in a single strike. And here's the brilliant cruelty of Philip's timing. He did this without consulting the Pope. Pope Clement V was technically the Templars' protector, but Philip presented him with a fait accompli. By the time the Pope even heard about it, the Templars were already in chains. Now comes the truly dark part, the interrogations. Philip needed confessions. The arrests were dramatic, but without confessions of heresy, the whole operation could backfire. So Philip's inquisitors got to work. Medieval interrogation meant torture. Specifically, torture designed to extract confessions while leaving the victim technically alive to stand trial. The most common method was the strappado. Your hands are tied behind your back, you're hoisted up by a rope, and then dropped suddenly. The shock dislocates your shoulders. It's excruciating, and it doesn't leave obvious marks, so you can still appear in court. There was also the rack, which stretched your body until joints separated. Fire applied to feet. Crushing devices for hands and fingers. Water torture. And these weren't quick sessions, interrogations could last days or weeks. Here's a specific example. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Templars, the highest-ranking Templar in the world, was interrogated for months. He was in his 60s, and he'd spent his entire adult life serving the order. Under torture, he confessed. He admitted to denying Christ, to spitting on the cross, to obscene rituals. His confession was read publicly in November 1307, and it devastated the Templar cause. If the Grand Master himself admitted to heresy, what defense did the rest of the order have? But here's what happened next. In December 1307, de Molay recanted. He publicly stated that his confession was false, extracted under torture. He declared that the Templars were innocent, that the accusations were lies, and that he'd rather die than dishonor the order with false testimony. This was incredibly brave and incredibly foolish. Recanting a confession of heresy was itself a heretical act. De Molay had just signed his own death warrant. Out of the roughly 138 Templars interrogated in Paris, 134 confessed under torture. Many later recanted, but the damage was done. Philip had his confessions, and he used them to justify the continued persecution of the order. Now, while this was happening in France, the rest of Europe was watching nervously. The Templars had properties and members in England, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Italy, everywhere. What would happen to them? Pope Clement V, under enormous pressure from Philip, issued a papal bull in November 1307 instructing all Christian monarchs to arrest the Templars in their territories and seize their assets. Some complied enthusiastically. Others were more reluctant. In England, King Edward II arrested the Templars but treated them relatively well. There was little torture, few confessions, and the English trials dragged on for years. Many English Templars were eventually released or transferred to other orders. In Spain and Portugal, the Templars were largely allowed to join other military orders. The Spanish kingdoms were still fighting Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula, and they needed experienced military orders. Persecuting the Templars didn't make strategic sense. In Germany and Italy, responses were mixed. Some areas arrested Templars, others ignored the papal bull entirely. But France was where the real destruction happened. Philip was determined to completely eliminate the French Templars, and he pursued them with ruthless efficiency. Between 1307 and 1314, the Templars in France faced a series of trials. These weren't fair trials in any modern sense. They were show trials, designed to publicly condemn the order and justify its suppression. The charges were read. Confessions, extracted under torture, were presented as evidence. Witnesses testified about alleged Templar crimes. The Templars themselves were rarely allowed to mount a meaningful defense. Many Templars who recanted their confessions were declared relapsed heretics and burned at the stake. This was the penalty for returning to heresy after confessing, and since the confessions were false to begin with, the whole thing was a legal fiction designed to justify executions. In May 1310, 54 Templars who had recanted their confessions were burned alive in Paris. It was a public spectacle, designed to terrify the remaining Templars into compliance. The message was clear: confess and you might live. Maintain your innocence or recant, and you burn. By 1312, Pope Clement V officially dissolved the Knights Templar. Not because they were guilty, the papal bull dissolving the order carefully avoids declaring them guilty of heresy, but because their reputation was so damaged that they could no longer function. This is a crucial point. The Pope didn't say the Templars were heretics. He said the accusations against them had made them useless as an organization. It was a political decision, not a legal one. The Templar assets were supposed to be transferred to another military order, the Knights Hospitaller. In reality, much of the wealth was seized by various kings, especially Philip IV, who'd engineered this whole thing specifically to get his hands on Templar property. But what about the leadership? What happened to Jacques de Molay and the other high-ranking Templars? They were kept in prison for years while their fate was decided. Finally, in March 1314, de Molay and 3 other senior Templars were brought before a papal commission in Paris to receive their sentences. The commission was prepared to sentence them to life imprisonment, a relatively merciful sentence, considering the charges. All de Molay had to do was publicly confess one more time and accept his fate. Instead, de Molay did something remarkable. Standing before the commission, he retracted his confession again. He declared that the Templars were innocent, that he and his brothers had been tortured into lying, and that the real crime was the destruction of the order. The crowd was stunned. King Philip IV was furious. De Molay had just publicly humiliated the king and the entire prosecution. Philip didn't wait for the Pope's response. That same day, March 18, 1314, he ordered de Molay and Geoffroy de Charny, another Templar who'd recanted, to be burned at the stake. That evening, on a small island in the Seine River, de Molay and de Charny were tied to stakes, and the fires were lit. According to legend, de Molay used his final moments to curse both Philip IV and Pope Clement V, summoning them to meet him before God's throne within a year. Whether he actually said this, we don't know. But here's what's spooky. Pope Clement V died in April 1314, just a month after de Molay's execution. King Philip IV died in November 1314, 8 months after. Both deaths were unexpected. This curse of the Templars became legendary, fueling centuries of conspiracy theories about the order's secret knowledge and power. With de Molay's death, the Knights Templar as an organization effectively ended. Some Templars fled to Scotland, where Robert the Bruce, excommunicated and at war with England, allegedly gave them refuge. Others joined different military orders. Some just disappeared into civilian life. The vast Templar wealth that Philip IV had coveted, most of it never materialized. The Templars, seeing the writing on the wall, had apparently moved or hidden much of their treasure before the arrests. Philip seized properties and some assets, but the legendary Templar treasure, the stuff of countless legends, was never found. This has fueled centuries of speculation. Did the Templars hide their treasure? Did they smuggle it out of France on their ships? Is it buried somewhere? The mystery has inspired everything from serious historical research to absolutely bonkers conspiracy theories. So what can we learn from the fall of the Templars? First, it demonstrates the vulnerability of even the most powerful organizations when faced with coordinated state action. The Templars had wealth, military power, and political connections, but they couldn't withstand a determined king willing to use the legal system as a weapon. Second, it shows how accusations of heresy could be weaponized for political and financial gain. Philip IV didn't care whether the Templars were actually guilty. He needed an excuse to destroy them, and heresy provided it. Third, the Friday the 13th timing, whether coincidental or deliberate, has had a lasting cultural impact. Some historians argue that Friday the 13th became considered unlucky because of the Templar arrests. Whether that's true or folk etymology, the date certainly entered historical infamy. Fourth, the fall of the Templars marked a shift in the relationship between church and state. The Pope's inability to protect the Templars from Philip IV showed that royal power was growing stronger than papal authority. This trend would continue, leading eventually to the Protestant Reformation. Fifth, it's a reminder of how historical events spawn lasting myths and legends. The Templars have been credited with everything from hiding the Holy Grail to discovering America to founding Freemasonry to guarding ancient secrets. None of these theories have solid evidence, but they persist because the Templars' sudden fall and lost treasure create the perfect conditions for mystery and speculation. The reality is probably more mundane. The Templars were a successful military and financial organization that became too powerful and too wealthy, making them a target for a desperate king. They were destroyed through a combination of political maneuvering, legal manipulation, and ruthless violence. But in their destruction, they achieved a kind of immortality. The Knights Templar, crushed in 1307, have lived on in legend, literature, and popular culture for over 700 years. Not bad for an organization that officially existed for less than 200 years. The dawn raids of October 13, 1307 were a masterstroke of medieval political calculation. Philip IV identified a target, manufactured a justification, coordinated a massive operation, and executed it with brutal efficiency. Within a day, he'd achieved what seemed impossible, bringing down the mighty Knights Templar. It's a story of power, greed, torture, and propaganda. It's a story of how institutions fall and how history can be manipulated. And it's a reminder that Friday the 13th earned its reputation the hard way. So the next time someone mentions the Knights Templar and their mysterious treasure, remember, the real story is even more dramatic than the legends. It involves coordinated military strikes, systematic torture, public executions, and the complete destruction of one of medieval Europe's most powerful organizations, all in the name of a king's debt problem. The Templars went to bed on Thursday night as the defenders of Christendom. They woke up Friday morning as accused heretics facing arrest, torture, and death. And by the time the sun set on Friday the 13th, their world had ended. That's not legend. That's history. And it's absolutely terrifying. Thanks for watching. If this changed how you think about the Knights Templar, medieval politics, or why Friday the 13th is unlucky, drop a comment below. What surprised you most? Did you know about the October 13th raids before this? And if you want more deep dives into medieval history's darkest moments, hit subscribe. Because trust me, we're just getting started with stories of intrigue, betrayal, and power struggles that make Game of Thrones look tame. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go check if there's any Templar treasure buried in my backyard. Just in case.